This is Dr. Michael Raffi. I will be reviewing with you today the neurophysiology section of the Costanzo textbook. We will begin with the Section 1, Organization of the Nervous System. The nervous system is a complex network that allows an organism to communicate with its environment. The network includes sensory components which detect changes in environmental stimuli, and motor components which generate movement, contraction of cardiac and smooth muscle, and glandular secretions. Integrative components of the nervous system receive, store, and process sensory information, and then orchestrate the appropriate motor responses. To understand neurophysiology, it is necessary to appreciate the organization of the nervous system and the gross anatomic arrangement of structures. A comprehensive presentation of neuroanatomy would be the subject of an entire text. Thus, in this chapter, the anatomy will be described briefly, as is appropriate for the physiologic context. The nervous system is composed of two divisions: the central nervous system, CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which includes sensory receptors, sensory nerves, and ganglia outside the central nervous system. The CNS and PNS communicate extensively with each other. Further distinction can be made between the sensory and motor divisions of the nervous system. The sensory or afferent division brings information into the nervous system, usually beginning with events in the sensory receptors in the periphery. These receptors include, but are not limited to, visual receptors, auditory receptors, chemoreceptors, and somatosensory or touch receptors. This afferent information is then transmitted to progressively higher levels of the nervous system and finally to the cerebral cortex. The motor or efferent division carries information out of the nervous system to the periphery. This efferent information results in contraction of skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or secretion by endocrine and exocrine glands. To illustrate and compare the functions of the sensory and motor divisions of the nervous system, consider an example introduced in Chapter 2, Regulation of Arterial Blood Pressure. Arterial blood pressure is sensed by baroreceptors, located in the walls of the carotid sinus. This information is transmitted via the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9, to the vasomotor center in the medulla of the brainstem. This is a sensory or afferent limb of blood pressure regulation. In the medulla, the sensed blood pressure is compared to a set point, and the medullary vasomotor center directs changes in sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow to the heart and blood vessels, which produce appropriate adjustments in arterial pressure. This is the motor or efferent limb of blood pressure regulation. The central nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord. The organization of major structures of the central nervous system is shown in Figures 3-1 and 3-2. Figure 3-1 shows the structures in their correct anatomic positions. These same structures are illustrated schematically in Figure 3-2, which may prove more useful as a reference. The major divisions of the central nervous system are the spinal cord, the brain stem, which includes the medulla, pons, and midbrain, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus and hypothalamus, and the cerebral hemispheres, which include cerebral cortex, white matter, basal ganglia, hippocampal formation, and amygdala. The spinal cord. The spinal cord is the most caudal portion of the central nervous system, extending from the base of the skull to the first lumbar vertebrae. The spinal cord is segmented with 31 pairs of spinal nerves that contain both sensory or afferent nerves and motor or efferent nerves. Sensory nerves carry information to the spinal cord from the skin, joints, muscles, and visceral organs in the periphery via dorsal root and cranial nerve ganglia. Motor nerves carry information from the spinal cord to the periphery and include both somatic motor nerves, which innervate skeletal muscle, and motor nerves of the autonomic nervous system, which innervate cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, and secretory cells. You can see Chapter 2 for further details. Information also travels up and down within the spinal cord. Ascending pathways in the spinal cord carry sensory information from the periphery to higher levels of the central nervous system. Descending pathways in the spinal cord carry motor information from higher levels of the central nervous system to the motor nerves that innervate the periphery. Brainstem. The medulla, pons, and midbrain are collectively called the brainstem. 10 of the 12 cranial nerves 3 through 12, arise in the brainstem. They carry sensory information to the brainstem and motor information away from it. Here is a diagram of the brain as well as the brainstem, and you can see the brainstem is located between the spinal cord and the brain. Another way to view the brainstem is in relation to the various levels in the central nervous system. At the very top is the cerebral cortex. Below that is the thalamus, which includes the hypothalamus and pituitary as well in its own relation. The brain stem, which includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, which is directly connected to the cerebellum. And finally, the spinal cord below the brain stem. This is a schematic diagram demonstrating the general structure of the central nervous system and where the brain stem rests within it. The components of the brain stem are as follows. The medulla is the rostral extension of the spinal cord. It contains autonomic centers that regulate breathing and blood pressure, as well as the centers that coordinate swallowing, coughing, and vomiting reflexes. See Chapter 2, Figure 2-5 for details. The pons is rostral to the medulla, and together with the centers in the medulla, participates in balance and maintenance of posture and in regulation of breathing. In addition, the pons relays information from the cerebral hemispheres to the cerebellum. The midbrain is rostral to the pons and participates in control of eye movements. It also contains relay nuclei of the auditory and visual systems. Cerebellum. The cerebellum is a foliated or leafy structure that is attached to the brainstem and lies dorsal to the pons and medulla. The functions of the cerebellum are coordination of movement, planning and execution of movement, maintenance of posture, and coordination of head and eye movements. The cerebellum, conveniently positioned between the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, integrates sensory information about position from the spinal cord, motor information from the cerebral cortex, and information about balance from the vestibular organs of the inner ear. Together, the thalamus and hypothalamus form the diencephalon, which means between brain. The term refers to the location of the thalamus and hypothalamus between the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. The thalamus processes almost all sensory information going to the cerebral cortex, and almost all motor information coming from the cerebral cortex to the brainstem and spinal cord. The only sensory system that does not use the thalamus to bring information to the brain is the olfactory system. The olfactory system bypasses the thalamus. It is the only sensory system that does not go through the thalamus. The hypothalamus lies ventral to the thalamus and contains centers that regulate body temperature, food intake, and water balance. The hypothalamus also is an endocrine organ that controls the hormone secretions of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus secretes releasing hormones and releasing inhibiting hormones into hypophyseal portal blood that cause release or inhibition of release of the anterior pituitary hormones. The hypothalamus also contains the cell bodies of neurons of the posterior pituitary gland that secrete antidiuretic hormone, ADH, as well as oxytocin. Cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres consist of the cerebral cortex, an underlying white matter, and 3 deep nuclei: basal ganglia, hippocampus, and amygdala. The functions of the cerebral hemispheres are perception, higher motor functions, cognition, memory, and emotion. The cerebral cortex is the convoluted surface of the cerebral hemispheres and consists of 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. These lobes are separated by sulci or grooves. The cerebral cortex receives and processes sensory information and integrates motor functions. These sensory and motor areas of the cortex are further designated as primary, secondary, and tertiary, depending on how directly they deal with sensory or motor processing. The primary areas are the most direct and involve the fewest number of synapses. The tertiary areas require the most complex processing and involve the greatest number of synapses. Association areas integrate diverse information for purposeful actions. For example, the limbic association area is involved in motivation, memory, and emotions. The following examples illustrate the nomenclature. Number 1. The primary motor cortex contains the upper motor neurons, which project directly to the spinal cord and activate lower motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscle. Number 2. The primary sensory cortices consist of the primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, and primary somatosensory cortex, and receive information from sensory receptors in the periphery, with only a few intervening synapses. Number 3. Secondary and tertiary sensory and motor areas surround the primary areas and are involved with more complex processing by connecting to association areas. Basal ganglia, hippocampus, and amygdala. There are 3 deep nuclei of the cerebral hemispheres. The basal ganglia consist of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. The basal ganglia receive input from all lobes of the cerebral cortex and have projections via the thalamus to the frontal cortex to assist in regulating movement. Hippocampus and amygdala are part of the limbic system. The hippocampus is involved in memory. The amygdala is involved with emotions and communicates with the autonomic nervous system via the hypothalamus. For example, the effect of the emotions on heart rate, pupil size, and hypothalamic hormone secretion. This concludes the section Organization of the Nervous System.